Welcome to the Form.IO portal. I'm going to walk you through the process of creating resources and forms to build your application on Form.IO. The first thing you'll want to do is create a project. Projects contain all the resources, forms, and settings that make up an application. Simply click the default application template project and the project will be created for you. This is the overview page. It gives you important information about your project, including the API endpoint, which is right over here. We're going to need that in a future video. This is also a great place to upgrade your project. You can click here or up here to do so, which will allow you access to additional features. To start building an application, I'm going to start with resources and forms. Both resources and forms are designed with a form builder. A lot of people ask what the difference between a resource and a form is, as they are very similar in many ways. Let's take a look at this from both a theoretical and a practical viewpoint. In theory, we like to think of resources as anything in your application that's a noun. That's a person, a place, or a thing. For example, this could be a company, users, movies, or cases, or something like that. In contrast, forms are for collecting more abstract pieces of data, such as surveys, HR forms, or questionnaires. The data in those don't necessarily relate to a specific person, place, or thing, or maybe it will be mapped to multiple resources. So if you have something that's a concrete thing, you map that to a resource versus everything else that's kind of just gathering data is more for forms. To make this a little clearer, let's take a look at the more practical side of resources versus forms. Resources have a few special properties. To start with, you can refer to a resource using a select or resource component. Let's take a look at an example of this. If we create a new resource called Publisher, and we're going to give it a name, field, and save this, we're going to create a publisher resource. So we're going to add Harper, Collins, and Westinghouse, just as a couple examples. So now we have this publisher resource with a couple of publishers inside of it. Inside of a form, we might want to gather information about books read. So we want the book title. In addition, we might want who the publisher is. Now, the simple way of doing this is just to use values, and we could do Harper, Collins, and Westinghouse, etc. But we also have the ability to directly reference a resource. We're going to say we're going to use the publisher resource, and we're going to do item.data.name, which is the way it's going to render. So now that we create this, we can pick Harper, Collins, and Westinghouse directly from the publisher. And now the publisher is directly tied to the resource I created. So if I preview it, I can say Curious George, and the publisher is HarperCollins, and submit it. And there we go. And now this isn't actually a string. This is directly tied via ID back to the resource I created. So that's one of the ways that a resource is different than a form. Another one, and I'll get into this more in a little bit, is that resources can be user objects inside of your system, whether that's a user or an admin. And you can allow users to either register or log in against these resources. So your user tables are actually resources in our system. In addition, you can provide access if it's a resource, whereas you can't with forms. So what makes forms a little bit more unique? Well, within your application, often there are lists of forms. And those lists of forms, such as books read, like I said, you might have surveys or HR forms, etc., that people can choose which one of them they want to take. And by using forms, you can dynamically add to that list within your application just by creating a new form, such as a survey, and tagging the form with one of the tags inside of your application, then it will add it to that section of your application. We can go into that more in a future video as well. But those are just some important things to think about when you're dealing with resources versus forms. Let's take a look at building an actual form. So you've seen me do that very quickly already, and I kind of skipped over a few pieces of it. But when you're building a form, it's a drag and drop interface where you drag fields onto the form. Now there are a lot of different types of components. There's basic components, which comprise the basic types of fields: text field, numbers, passwords, text areas. Passwords, by the way, are very useful for your user resources. Checkboxes, select boxes, which is a list of checkboxes. So 1, 2, 3, and you can select which ones of these you want to allow them to have. Selects, which are drop downs, which you can tie to either a set of values or a URL or JSON or a resource, or do custom values as well. A radio, which is a radio. HTML, which displays an HTML element on the page that you can customize. Content is if you need to type some text on the page. You can also add images and different other formatting to it as well. And then if you want to add a button to either submit or cancel or reset the form. In addition, we have some really great special components such as the email field, the phone number field, address, date, time, currency, hidden, which allows you to put hidden values on the form that will be saved, resource, which is similar to the select but is tied directly to the resource. Most of the things you can do with the resource field, you can do with the select field now, so this is less useful. You can upload files if you connect it to a file provider. The signature field, which is really cool, it allows you to add signatures to your form, and then they can sign it both on a mobile device and in the browser. Custom allows you to add custom components. And there's also the container and the data grid. I'm going to go into these more later in detail, but briefly, the container allows you to group multiple fields into one key as an object, and a data grid allows you to have multiple objects in an array in your data. So using these two, you can really morph the data to look however you want. And then survey is a very common field type where you have multiple questions and multiple answers that you want to map them to. And then you can say, you like this. So you can build surveys like that. Another really important feature of our form builder is the layout components. And layout components allow you to lay the data out in a more logical way. So for example, if you wanted to have columns on your page, you can add columns in here and then put question 1 on the left and maybe put question 2 on the right. And these are using Bootstrap classes to create the columns. So as your screen goes narrow, eventually they will collapse down. It doesn't do it on this one, but when I preview it, it will. See, it collapsed down when it goes narrower on like a phone. In addition, we have field set, panels, which allow you to just have a little bit more stuff. Tables allow you to create a table of fields. And then the well allows just kind of a call out look to it. And these are all Bootstrap types of classes. In addition, you can use existing resource fields, which is another one of the distinguishing characteristics of resources. So if you have fields that you want to be able to drag onto multiple forms, you can put them into a resource and reuse them across multiple forms. Once you've created your forms, and resource creation is very much the same. It looks almost identical when you're creating it. You drag your fields across. It's the same fields, etc., and you just create it. Give it a name, my resource, and that's pretty much it. What's cool about forms and resources with Form.IO is it actually does a few things when you create this form. Not only does it create a pretty looking form, it also creates an API behind it. And what that means is you have a full REST API immediately. So I've created publisher, I created survey, I created books read, and each one of these behind it has a full REST API. So I can um, post, get, I can create, read, update, delete, all of this different stuff to all of the data that gets submitted to this form. So in addition, I can go in here and preview it and say, my name, number 123, submit, and it immediately is capturing that data via that API, and I can go view more of it. So I can create another name and submit to that, and now in my data I can view, I can click on it, I can view the data, I can edit it, I can save it, I can go in here and delete it, and do anything that I want to do is from a data management perspective for the data behind my form and my resources. In addition, you have a when it was created and when it was last updated saved with every resource in your database. So that's kind of creating resources and forms. Now, you also have the ability to fire off actions whenever you create a form or whenever a form or resource is interacted with. For example, by default, all forms and resources have the save submission form action. And what that does is it will save it to the database that we have. Now, maybe you don't want to do that. For example, I'm going to create a form called don't save. I'm going to add a field to it. I'm going to call it name and create it. Now I can go into this actions and delete the save submission action. Now when you submit this form, it's not going to do anything. So I'm going to say don't save me, and I'm going to submit it from the preview. When I go into the data, it's not there because it never saved. Now that's a kind of a silly example. Why would you want to do that? But sometimes you don't want to save a submission. There are lots of other actions you can perform. For example, you can send an email to somebody whenever somebody submits this form. You can fire a webhook and send the data off to a third-party service or a service that you create. In fact, we have a webhook receiver library in our GitHub pages that allows you to easily set up a webhook provider that can send the data to it and then connect that with your own database. You can assign a role, you can reset your password, you can do a login action. In addition, you can send it to Google Sheets, as well as many other premium actions, and there are many more that we can add to your platform as well. So there's lots of different things you can do inside of forms and resources. And I want to take a quick look right now at a couple of special resources and what happens with them, and that is the user resource, and we can kind of get an idea of what happens with the actions. So if we look at this, by default, the user resource saves a submission and it has a role assignment action. And what the role assignment action will do is assign the authenticated role to any users that are logged into the system. Another important place to look is the user login and user register form. Let's take a quick look at the user register actions. And those ones, the register form saves the submission, but it actually saves it to the user resource. And then it performs a login, which returns the access token to the client on the front end. In addition, the user login form simply does a login action, doesn't need to save anywhere because we're not actually saving. But you could save the submission on the user login form, and then you're recording every time somebody logs into your application. We don't really want that though. So that's kind of what you can do with the actions system. You can do you can either send the data things, or you can perform user actions, or you can do many, many different things by just adding actions to the actions section of each of your forms. The other interesting part of this is you can control who has access to which forms in your system. So if we look at this list of forms, for example, the login form, we want to allow anyone who is anonymous to log in to your system, and that's why we have anonymous as access to login. Once they're logged in, they'll no longer have the anonymous role. Then if we want to have the survey and give that access, by default, nobody has access to it. Maybe we want to give anonymous people access to create those submissions. We can do that. Or we want to say authenticated people need to be able to create submissions to the survey form as well. Maybe administrators can read all of the submissions, and they can also update all of the submissions. The submission permissions are designed around who owns the submission. That's the person who originally created it. And so you can also say any of the submissions. So the read all submissions allows the administrator to read it regardless of who originally created it. So this is a really nice way of saying allow some users the ability to create, read, or update their own submissions, but not everybody else's. But administrators or people with elevated permissions can do that with all of the submissions. In addition, you have the ability, if you have a resource field on there, to assign permissions based on who's in that resource field. A normal example of this is if you have a sales quote, maybe you assign it to a specific salesperson, and you can assign them read access based on that field, and that will give them permission to that. Even though they don't own it, they can get access to it. That's a more advanced topic we can save for later. So we've now explored both what the difference between resources and forms are, exploring the API behind them. You can also view the data for each one of these, either through the data tab or the data up here. The final thing I kind of want to show you is whenever you're creating your applications, one of the first things you're going to want to do is create a user if you have user authentications to be able to log in. And this is something that often trips people up, so I want to show you really quick. And if you go to either the user or the admin resource, I'm going to just pick the user and preview it. This will allow me to create a user at example.com, just give them a password and submit. And now I have a user of my application. And one thing that's important to understand is you are actually creating an application that is separate from Form.IO, that has its own users tables, it has its own admins, and it's a completely separate app. It runs on Form.IO, but it's separate. And this is why inside of your application, you don't use your Form.IO login, you use any users that are created within your user resource to log in. So that's a very brief overview of many of the features and capabilities of our portal. Next, I'm going to show you how to download the basic application template and start setting it up so you can start building the application with all of your resources and forms inside of it. Thanks.